I found out my sister had been seeing my husband behind my back just days before his funeral, and in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It went completely still. I remember standing in my kitchen, the late afternoon light stretching across the marble countertop we had picked out together 15 years ago. A space that once felt warm now carrying a silence so thick it pressed against my chest, and Diane was sitting across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, her voice soft, almost practiced, offering condolences that suddenly sounded hollow, rehearsed, like lines from a script she had memorized long before that day ever came, and I watched her carefully, not as a grieving sister anymore, but as someone seeing a stranger for the first time. Noticing the small details I had ignored for years, the way she avoided my eyes for just a second too long, the way she spoke about my husband with a familiarity that no longer felt innocent, the way her sympathy never quite reached her expression, and I didn't ask questions, not then, not when the realization first settled into my bones, because something told me that answers given too easily would never be the truth. So I did what I had always done best. I stayed quiet, I observed, and I let the silence do the work, because silence has a way of revealing things people think they've hidden well. And over the next few days, as the house filled with flowers and casseroles and polite conversations from people who believed they understood loss, I began to notice the cracks widening. Small inconsistencies in stories, a misplaced receipt, a message that flashed briefly on a screen before being locked away, and none of it was loud, none of it was dramatic, but it was enough for me to start piecing together a truth that felt colder than anything I had ever known. And still, I didn't confront her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse, because I wasn't interested in a confession. I was interested in certainty, and certainty takes patience. It takes restraint. It takes the ability to sit across from someone who has wronged you in ways they believe you'll never discover and smile as if nothing has changed, and that's exactly what I did. I smiled when she came over the next evening, bringing another dish I knew I wouldn't eat. I thanked her when she offered to help organize the paperwork, and I watched as she moved through my home with a familiarity that now made perfect sense. And the more I watched, the clearer everything became, not just what had happened, but how long it had been happening, how carefully it had been hidden in plain sight, woven into ordinary moments I had trusted without question. And in those quiet hours after everyone had gone home, when the house returned to its heavy stillness, I sat alone and let every memory replay itself, not with emotion, but with clarity, and piece by piece, the picture came together, not as something chaotic or explosive, but as something deliberate, something calculated. And by the time the week ended, I realized I wasn't the one who had lost control of my life. I was the only one who truly understood what had happened, and more importantly, what would happen next. Because while Diane believed she had taken something from me, she had no idea what she had set in motion, and I intended to let her keep believing that for just a little while longer. I did not confront her the next morning, even though she stood in my doorway holding a grocery bag like she belonged there, like nothing had changed, like she had not quietly stepped into a place in my life that was never hers to take. And I stepped aside and let her in because that was the easiest way to keep the truth exactly where I needed it, hidden in plain sight. And she walked straight into the kitchen without asking, placing things on the counter with a confidence that would have felt comforting a week ago but now only confirmed what I already knew. And I watched her move through the space as if she had memorized it, the cabinets, the drawers, the rhythm of a home that she should have only known as a guest. And still I said nothing, not because I was unsure, but because I was becoming very certain, and certainty required time, not emotion. And she started talking about practical things, paperwork, appointments, the kind of details people focus on when they want to appear helpful, and I nodded at the right moments, letting her believe she was in control of the conversation, letting her fill the silence with explanations I never asked for, because people reveal more when they think they are guiding the narrative. And every word she spoke added another piece to something I was quietly building, something she could not see. And when she mentioned the bank without me bringing it up, just casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world, I felt that stillness return, sharper this time, because that was not a mistake, that was knowledge, and knowledge always comes from access. And I turned toward her slowly, just enough to meet her eyes, and I smiled in a way that made her relax, just a little. just enough for her guard to lower in a way she did not even realize, and I thanked her, genuinely. Because gratitude disarms people. It makes them believe they are trusted, and trust makes them careless, and she stayed longer than she needed to, lingering in the living room, picking up framed photos, commenting on memories that now sounded different when she spoke about them, like she had been there in ways I had never noticed before. And I let her talk. I let her rewrite moments out loud, because the more she spoke, the more she confirmed what I already understood, that this was not something recent, not something impulsive, but something that had been quietly unfolding over time, layered into ordinary days until it became invisible. And when she finally left, closing the door behind her with a soft click, the house felt quieter than before, but it was no longer heavy. It was focused, like everything had narrowed into a single direction. And I walked back into the kitchen, looking at the items she had brought, noticing what she chose, what she assumed I needed. And I realized that she had been preparing for this version of my life long before I ever imagined it. And that realization did not hurt the way it should have. It clarified everything. And I moved through the house slowly, not as someone grieving anymore, but as someone taking inventory, not just of objects, but of patterns, access, behavior. And by the end of that morning, I understood something important, something that changed the way I saw every interaction that followed. Diane believed I was overwhelmed. She believed I was distracted. She believed I was too consumed by loss to notice anything beyond the surface. And that belief was exactly what I needed her to hold on to, because as long as she thought I was still trying to catch up, she would never realize that I was already several steps ahead. The evening of the family dinner arrived exactly as expected, quiet on the surface and carefully arranged beneath. And I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, not to fix my appearance but to study my own expression, making sure it reflected exactly what everyone would expect to see, something composed, something tired, something believable. And when I walked into the dining room, the table was already set, Diane moving between the kitchen and the chairs with an ease that no longer surprised me, placing plates as if she had done it 100 times before. And perhaps she had, just not when I was paying attention. And she greeted me with that same soft tone, the one she had been using all week, gentle and supportive. And I returned it with a nod and a small smile, because consistency mattered. And the others began to arrive shortly after, filling the house with familiar voices and the kind of low conversations that circle around loss without ever fully naming it. And I watched how Diane positioned herself, never too close to me, never too far, always within reach of the narrative she was carefully maintaining, offering help, answering questions, guiding discussions in subtle ways that would have seemed thoughtful to anyone who was not looking closely. And I took my seat at the head of the table, the place that still felt like mine, even if everything else had shifted. And dinner began with the usual exchanges, polite, measured, predictable, but underneath it all, I noticed the details that no one else did. The way Diane avoided certain topics unless she could control them, the way she anticipated questions before they were asked, the way she redirected attention with a precision that spoke of preparation, not instinct. And when someone mentioned finances, casually, as people often do when trying to be helpful, she responded too quickly, offering reassurance, mentioning that things were already being handled, that there was a plan in place. And the table quieted for just a second longer than normal, not enough to raise suspicion, but enough for me to feel the shift. And I leaned back slightly, letting the conversation move forward without interruption, because this was not the moment to challenge anything. This was the moment to confirm, and confirmation came in small, steady pieces, in the way she spoke about accounts she should not have known about, in the way she referenced decisions that had not been shared with her, in the way she assumed authority without ever asking for it. And I kept my expression neutral, occasionally adding a comment, occasionally asking a simple question that seemed harmless but revealed just a little more each time. And no one noticed the pattern, no one except me. And as the night continued, the room filled with the kind of comfort that comes from routine, people laughing softly, sharing stories, believing that everything was unfolding as it should. And Diane relaxed into that atmosphere, her movements becoming more natural, her voice more confident, as if she believed the hardest part was already behind her. And I let her believe that. I let the entire evening pass without a single moment of confrontation, without a single raised voice. Because control is not about reacting, it is about timing. And when the dinner finally ended and everyone began to gather their things, offering their goodbyes and their support, I walked them to the door one by one, thanking them, maintaining the same calm presence I had held all night. And Diane lingered until the very end, standing in the hallway as if she expected something more, some acknowledgement, some sign that she had successfully stepped into a role she had quietly claimed. And I looked at her, meeting her eyes just long enough to let her feel seen, and then I smiled again, the same controlled, measured smile, and told her good night, because there was nothing she needed to hear from me yet. And as the door closed behind her, I stood there for a moment in the silence, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, but focused, because everything I needed was already in place, and the only thing left was deciding exactly when to use it. It was not a single moment that confirmed everything. It was a series of small details that refused to stay hidden, the kind of details most people overlook because they do not expect betrayal to exist so close to home. And the morning after the dinner, I began noticing them with a clarity that felt almost clinical, starting with something simple, something that would have meant nothing a week ago. A drawer in the study slightly out of place, not open, not obviously disturbed, just not exactly how I remembered leaving it. And I stood there for a moment, looking at it without touching it, because observation always comes before action. And when I finally stepped closer, I realized it was not just the drawer, it was what was inside, files arranged just a little too neatly, as if someone had gone through them and then tried to restore the order from memory rather than familiarity. And that was the difference. Subtle but unmistakable, because when you truly belong somewhere, you do not need to guess where things go. And I closed the drawer without making a sound, letting that detail settle into the growing list in my mind. And later that afternoon, another piece revealed itself, not through intention, but through carelessness. Diane had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she stepped outside to take a call, something she had never done before, something that told me she was becoming comfortable. And comfort always leads to mistakes, and I did not rush toward it. I did not even move immediately. I simply continued what I was doing for a few seconds longer, giving the moment time to remain ordinary. And then I walked over, slowly, as if I had every right to be there, which I did, and the screen lit up with a notification, just one line, just enough to shift everything from assumption to certainty. A bank alert, not mine, not one I had ever seen, but one connected to an account that should not have existed in the context of my life. And I did not touch the phone. I did not need to, because the information had already done its job, and I stepped away just as quietly as I had approached, returning to my place before she came back inside, her expression composed, her tone steady, never realizing that the smallest slip had confirmed the largest truth. And from that point on, everything aligned with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. The way she referenced timing that matched transactions I had not yet reviewed, the way she positioned herself in conversations about legal matters, always guiding, always suggesting, never asking, and I allowed it every single time, because each suggestion was another thread, and I was beginning to see the full pattern, not chaotic, not impulsive, but structured, deliberate, built over time with the assumption that it would never be challenged. And that assumption was her greatest mistake, because while she believed I was still piecing things together, I was already moving beyond discovery into preparation, and preparation required patience, not reaction. And that night, as I sat alone in the quiet of the house, I opened the laptop that had been sitting untouched for days, not out of avoidance, but out of timing, and I began to look at everything with new eyes, not as a wife trying to understand loss, but as someone examining a situation with precision, tracing connections, identifying inconsistencies. And the more I looked, the clearer it became that what I had initially seen as fragments were actually parts of a much larger design, one that Diane believed she controlled completely. And I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle without emotion, because emotion would only slow me down, and I had no intention of slowing down now, not when the truth was finally revealing itself exactly as I needed it to, piece by piece, in perfect silence. By the time I started looking back, I realized the truth had never actually been hidden. It had simply been arranged in a way that made it easy to dismiss, easy to excuse, easy to ignore if you trusted the people involved. And I had trusted them completely, which now felt less like innocence and more like a carefully maintained advantage that had worked against me. Because as I replayed the years in my mind, the pattern was no longer subtle. It was consistent, stretching back further than I wanted to admit, into moments that once felt insignificant but now carried a different weight. And I remembered how Diane had always been present, always nearby during important milestones, offering help that no one questioned, inserting herself into situations that seemed harmless at the time, birthdays, holidays, small gatherings where she would stay a little longer than everyone else, finding reasons to linger, to be involved, to observe. And I had never seen it as anything more than closeness, the kind of closeness people admire in families. But now that same closeness looked different, calculated, intentional, and I could trace it even further to the way she spoke about my life as if it were partially hers, the way she would finish sentences for me, make decisions in conversations before I had the chance to respond, subtle things that never felt like overstepping because they were always wrapped in concern, always framed as support, and I accepted it because it was easier than questioning it, because questioning it would have meant acknowledging something I was not ready to see. And then there were the moments with my husband, the ones that now stood out with a clarity that felt almost precise, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, shared, looks that I had once interpreted as familiarity, as comfort, as nothing more than the result of years spent around each other. And I remembered dismissing those thoughts quickly, correcting myself, reminding myself that trust was the foundation of everything. That suspicion without proof was unnecessary, and now I understood that it was not just trust that kept me from seeing it. It was expectation. The expectation that certain lines would never be crossed, especially not by someone so close. And that expectation had created the perfect cover, because it allowed everything to exist in plain sight without ever being fully recognized. And as I sat there, letting these memories settle into something more structured, I realized that what I was looking at was not a series of isolated events. It was a progression, a gradual shift from access to influence, from influence to control, and eventually to something much more deliberate, something that extended beyond personal boundaries into areas that required planning, coordination, and time. And that realization did not come with anger, it came with clarity. Because once you see a pattern for what it is, you cannot unsee it, and more importantly, you can begin to anticipate it. And anticipation is where control begins. And I understood then that Diane had not acted impulsively. She had acted with confidence, the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you will never be questioned, never be challenged. And that belief had shaped everything she did. From the way she positioned herself in my home to the way she navigated conversations about things that were never hers to manage. And I leaned back slightly, letting that understanding settle without resistance. Because there was no benefit in reacting to something that had already happened. The value was in recognizing it fully, completely, without hesitation. And as the last pieces of that realization fell into place, I felt that same stillness return, not as a reaction, but as a decision. Because now that I understood how long this had been unfolding, I also understood exactly how carefully I needed to respond. Not with emotion, not with confrontation, but with precision. Because precision was the only way to match something that had been built this deliberately over time. I began with the documents because documents do not lie. They only reflect what has already been done. And I sat at the desk earlier than usual that morning. The house still quiet, the kind of quiet that allows you to think without interruption, and I opened each file slowly, not searching for something dramatic, but for consistency, because consistency reveals intent, and intent is what turns suspicion into certainty. And the first few records looked normal, expected even, the kind of routine financial movement that happens over time. But then the pattern shifted, not abruptly, not in a way that would raise immediate concern, but just enough to stand out when you were looking closely. Small transfers, repeated at regular intervals, amounts that were modest on their own, but significant when viewed together. And I followed them carefully, tracing each one to its destination, not rushing, not skipping steps, because every detail mattered. And as the path became clearer, I noticed something that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The account receiving those transfers was not one I recognized, not one that had ever been part of any discussion, and yet it had been connected long enough to establish a pattern, which meant it had been planned, not improvised. and I leaned back for a moment, letting that realization settle, not as a shock, but as confirmation, because by then, I was no longer surprised by what I found, only interested in how it had been done, and I continued, moving from bank statements to emails, from emails to archived records, each step, revealing another layer of coordination, another indication that access had been granted, not taken, and that distinction mattered, because it meant trust had been used as a tool, not respected as a boundary. And when I reached the legal documents, the ones that outlined ownership, authority, and decision-making, I slowed down even more, reading each line carefully, not once, but twice. Because this was where intention became structure, and structure is what determines outcome, and there it was. Subtle but unmistakable, changes that had been made quietly, adjustments that shifted control in ways that would not be obvious without context, and Diane's influence was present in those details, not directly, not in a way that could be easily pointed out, but in the timing, in the alignment with everything else I had already uncovered, and I closed the file gently, not out of hesitation, but because I had seen enough to move forward, and the next step was not discovery, it was preparation, and preparation required discretion. So I made a few calls that afternoon, simple ones, quiet ones, asking questions without revealing intent, confirming processes, understanding what could be done and how it could be done without drawing attention. And each answer gave me more clarity, more control, because control does not come from reacting, it comes from knowing your options before anyone else realizes they exist. And when Diane stopped by later that day, unannounced but entirely predictable, I greeted her the same way I had every time before, calm, composed, unchanged. Because the most important part of preparation is making sure no one knows you are preparing, and she spoke about plans again, about what needed to be handled, about how things would move forward, and I listened, nodding occasionally, letting her believe she was still guiding the situation, because belief is powerful, and as long as she believed she was in control, she would not question anything. And by the time she left, I was no longer piecing things together, I was arranging them, placing each piece exactly where it needed to be, not for understanding, but for use, because everything I had uncovered was no longer just information, it was leverage, and leverage, when used correctly, does not require force, it only requires timing. The plan did not begin with confrontation, it began with positioning, because confrontation without control is just noise, and I had no interest in noise, so I started with something simple, something that would seem natural to anyone watching, including Diane. I told her I needed help organizing a small family gathering, something informal, just a way to bring everyone together again after everything that had happened. And she agreed immediately, almost too quickly, stepping into the role with a confidence that confirmed exactly what I needed. She believed she was already at the center of everything, and that belief made her predictable, and predictability is what makes a plan work. And over the next few days, I let her take the lead in visible ways, choosing the time, suggesting the menu, reaching out to relatives, all the things that would reinforce her sense of control, while quietly handling everything that actually mattered behind the scenes, confirming attendance, making sure the right people would be there, the ones who needed to hear the truth, the ones who would understand what they were seeing when the time came. And I kept my involvement minimal, just enough to appear present, never enough to raise suspicion, and Diane filled that space exactly as expected, becoming more comfortable, more certain, more open in the way she spoke about plans, about decisions, about things that were never hers to decide. And I listened carefully, not to respond, but to measure, because every word she said gave me a clearer picture of how far she believed she had already succeeded. And that picture was important, because it told me exactly how much she would not see coming. And as the day of the gathering approached, I made one final adjustment, something small but necessary. I arranged for a few documents to be easily accessible, not hidden, not displayed, just present in a way that would make sense when the moment arrived. And I reviewed everything one more time, not out of doubt, but out of precision, because precision is what separates intention from execution. And when the evening finally came, the house filled again with familiar voices, the same people, the same setting. But this time, everything was different, because this time, I was not observing to understand, I was observing to confirm that everything was exactly where it needed to be. And Diane moved through the room with the same ease she had shown before, greeting people, guiding conversations, stepping into the role she believed she had secured, and I allowed it. I allowed the entire evening to unfold naturally, without interruption, without challenge, because timing is not about urgency. It is about certainty, and I was waiting for the exact moment when certainty would no longer belong to her. And as I watched her laugh, speak, and move through my home as if it were partially hers, I realized something that made the next step even clearer. She was not expecting resistance, not from me, not from anyone. And that absence of expectation was the final piece I needed. Because when someone believes they are completely secure, they stop protecting themselves. And when they stop protecting themselves, they reveal everything. And I stood there quietly, holding that. Understanding without emotion, without hesitation, knowing that everything was already in place. Not just the setting, not just the people, but the truth itself, arranged in a way that no one would be able to ignore once it was revealed. And for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself a small moment of certainty, not about what had happened, but about what was about to happen next. The moment arrived without announcement, without any dramatic shift in the room, just a natural pause in conversation that most people would not have noticed, but I did, because I had been waiting for it. And I set my glass down slowly, letting the quiet settle just enough before I spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just clearly. And everyone turned toward me with the same expectation they had carried all evening, that I would say something polite, something appropriate, something predictable. And for a brief second, Diane held that same expectation, standing across the room with a calm expression that had not changed since she arrived, and I met her eyes before I said anything else, because this was the only moment that mattered, the point where everything shifted, and I thanked everyone for coming, keeping my tone even, measured, the same way I had spoken all night, and I could feel the room relax slightly, reassured by the familiarity of it. And then I continued, just enough to change the direction without raising suspicion, mentioning that there were a few things I had recently come across while organizing paperwork, things that I thought should be clarified while everyone was present, and the shift was immediate, not loud, not obvious, but real. Conversation stopped, attention focused, and I reached for the folder I had placed nearby earlier, opening it with the same calm precision I had maintained from the beginning. And I did not rush, I did not dramatize, I simply began to lay out the information piece by piece, starting with the financial records, the patterns, the transfers, explaining them in a way that made them easy to follow, not accusing, not emotional, just factual. And as I spoke, I watched Diane carefully, not for a reaction, but for confirmation. And it came in the smallest ways, the slight tightening of her posture, the pause before she moved, the momentary stillness that replaced her earlier ease, and I continued without acknowledging it, because acknowledgement would have given her space to respond. And this was not about giving her space, it was about removing it. And when I moved to the next set of documents, the ones that outlined the changes in authority and access, I placed them on the table where everyone could see, letting the details speak for themselves, letting the alignment between everything become clear without needing interpretation. And the room had gone completely quiet by then, not tense, not chaotic, just focused, as if everyone was processing the same realization at the same time. And I did not look around. I kept my attention exactly where it needed to be, steady, controlled. And when I finally spoke her name, I did it the same way I had said everything else that night, calmly, without emphasis. And I asked a simple question, one that did not accuse but did not allow for deflection either, a question that required clarity, not explanation. And for the first time since I had begun, Diane did not respond immediately, and that silence, brief as it was, said more than anything she could have said out loud. And I let it sit there, not filling it, not easing it, because silence has a way of making truth unavoidable. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not as steady as it had been before, not because I had raised mine, but because control had shifted, and once control shifts, everything else follows. And I closed the folder slowly, not as an ending, but as a signal, because by that point, nothing else needed to be said. Everything that mattered was already in front of them, clear, structured, undeniable. And I stepped back slightly, not retreating, but allowing the weight of what had just been revealed to settle fully in the room, knowing that this was not about a single moment of exposure. It was about the complete removal of the narrative she had built, and once that narrative was gone, there was nothing left for her to stand on. No one spoke immediately after that, not because they did not have something to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place, and I could see it in the way their expressions shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that the narrative they had accepted all evening had quietly collapsed, and Diane remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing there as if movement itself required a decision she had not prepared for. And I did not look away from her, not to challenge her, not to pressure her, but simply to acknowledge that the space she had been occupying no longer belonged to her. And the difference was unmistakable, because control is not something you announce. It is something that becomes visible the moment it changes hands. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a hesitation that had not been there before, the certainty replaced by something less defined, something that could not hold the same weight in a room that had already seen too much. And I did not interrupt, I did not correct. I allowed her to speak because there was no longer any need to manage the outcome. The outcome had already been set in motion the moment the truth was placed where everyone could see it, and one by one, the others began to respond, not with confrontation, not with raised voices, but with distance, subtle at first, a step back, a shift in posture, a change in tone. The kind of reactions that do not need to be explained to be understood, and that distance grew quickly, because once trust is removed, it does not leave gradually. It disappears all at once, and Diane could feel it, even if she did not fully understand how to respond to it. And I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was never about creating a scene. It was about allowing the truth to exist without interference, and once it did, everything else followed naturally, and I reached for the final document, not to prove anything further, but to complete the structure I had built, placing it on the table with the same calm precision, outlining the steps that had already been taken to secure everything moving forward, the corrections that had been made, the access that had been removed, the decisions that had been finalized without the need for discussion. And I did not look at her when I did it, because this was no longer about her. It was about closure, and closure does not require acknowledgement from the person who caused the damage. It only requires certainty from the person who restores it. And the room remained quiet as those details settled in. Not heavy, not tense, just resolved, and I stepped away from the table, slowly, giving space for everyone to process what they had seen, what they had understood, and what they would carry with them after they left. And Diane did not speak again, not because she could not, but because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been established. And that was the difference between assumption and reality. Assumption can be maintained with confidence, but reality does not require it. And as the evening came to a close, people began to leave. Quietly, their goodbyes softer, more measured, not out of discomfort, but out of understanding. And when the last door closed and the house returned to silence, I stood there for a moment, not overwhelmed, not relieved, just steady, because everything that needed to happen had happened exactly the way it was supposed to. And for the first time since all of this began, there was nothing left to uncover, nothing left to prepare, nothing left to manage, only the quiet certainty that what had been taken from me had not defined the outcome, and that the ending belonged entirely to me.